The palace of the Alpha King did not wake up with the sun. It had no need to. It was already awake long before the world outside remembered how to breathe. Inside its towering stone walls, silence was not an absence of sound, it was a law. A living law. One that pressed down on every hallway, every staircase, every shadowed corner where light refused to stay too long. The servants never called it silence. They called it survival. And in this place, survival meant learning one truth faster than anything else. Nothing in the palace was ever as simple as it looked. The maid moved through the eastern corridor with careful steps. Her head remained lowered, not out of respect, but habit. Her hands carried folded garments pressed into perfect order, each piece stacked with precision she had learned through repetition, not understanding. 5 years in the palace had taught her one thing above all. If you are invisible, you are safe. Or at least, less likely to disappear. The corridor she walked through was long enough to feel endless. Stone pillars rose like frozen guards on either side, carved with symbols no servant was allowed to interpret. Some said they were warnings. Others said they were memories. No one who worked in the palace stayed long enough to confirm either belief. The maid kept walking. Her footsteps were soft, but even softness felt loud here. Because the palace listened. Not in a magical way that anyone admitted openly, but in a way everyone feared silently. Doors that should remain closed sometimes shifted slightly when someone thought too loudly nearby. Candles burned brighter when secrets were spoken too close. And the air itself always felt like it was waiting for permission. The maid had learned not to give it. Still, that night was different. It began like every other night shift. A list of duties. A tray of folded garments. A route she had walked dozens of times before without consequence. But the palace never repeated itself exactly. Small changes always appeared. A hallway that felt slightly longer than before. A door that seemed heavier than memory remembered. A sound that did not belong. And tonight, it was warmth. Not heat. Not fire. Something subtler. Something alive. As she approached the lower wing corridor, she felt it first in her skin. A gentle rise in temperature. Like stepping too close to a sleeping body. Her pace slowed without permission. Her instincts tightening before her thoughts could explain why. The laundry room was ahead. Everyone knew it. Everyone avoided it. But no one ever said why in full sentences. Only fragments were shared between servants when they thought no one important was listening. Never enter after dusk. It hears you when you're inside. If the door closes, don't wait for it to open again. The maid had never believed in those fragments. Not because she was brave, but because belief was expensive in the palace. And she could not afford things she could not prove. Still, belief was not required for fear. And fear was growing now. She stopped walking. The corridor ahead looked normal. Too normal. That was the problem. The doors on either side were shut, as always. The stone floor was clean, as always. Even the lantern light flickered in its usual controlled rhythm. But something felt misaligned. Like the world had shifted a fraction of an inch and never corrected itself. Then she saw it. The laundry room door. At first, it looked unchanged. Heavy wood. Iron handle. The same faint carvings near the edges that servants were taught not to trace with their fingers. But then her eyes focused. And her breath slowed. The door was not fully closed. It was open. Just slightly. Not wide enough to suggest an invitation. Not small enough to ignore. It was a mistake that looked intentional. The kind of mistake the palace never made. The maid's fingers tightened around the folded garments in her arms. She should have turned around. That was the correct decision. The safe decision. The decision that kept people alive longer. But something about the opening felt wrong in a different way. It did not feel like danger calling. It felt like danger already inside. And she had just noticed it too late. A soft sound drifted from the gap. Fabric shifting. Slow. Rhythmic. Like something turning over in sleep. The maid's throat tightened. She told herself it was cloth settling. Laundry being moved. Simple explanations. Harmless ones. But her feet refused to turn away. That was the second problem. Her body was no longer obeying logic. It was obeying curiosity. And curiosity, in the Alpha King's palace, was not a trait. It was a warning sign. She took one step closer. Then another. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the air thickened around her decision. The door loomed closer. The warmth intensified. Now it felt undeniable. Something was inside. Alive. Breathing. Waiting. She reached the door. Her hand hovered over the iron handle. For a brief moment, everything in her mind became perfectly still. No thoughts. No fear. Only the sensation of standing at the edge of something that could not be undone. Then she touched it. The metal was warm. Too warm. Like it had been held recently by something that did not cool down like normal life. Her fingers tightened. And she pushed. The door opened without resistance. No creak. No protest. Only a soft release of air. As if the room had been holding its breath for her arrival. The maid stepped inside. And the world changed shape. The first thing she noticed was the order. Everything was too perfect. Stacks of folded fabric rose in precise geometric formations, arranged in patterns that felt deliberate rather than functional. Nothing was misplaced. Nothing was random. Even the shadows between stacks felt structured, as if designed rather than created. The air was thick with quiet. Not empty quiet. Contained quiet. The kind that suggested something had been silenced rather than absent. Her eyes adjusted slowly. Her heart beat louder than anything else in the room. Then she saw the center. And everything inside her stopped. A massive shape rested among the folded linen stacks. Large enough to dominate the room without moving. Curled. Still. Sleeping. The Alpha King's beast. She had never seen it before. Only heard fragments spoken in fear by older servants who refused to finish their stories. A creature that did not belong to the natural order. A force that answered only to the Alpha King. A presence that made even trained guards hesitate before speaking its name. And yet here it was. Not chained. Not caged. Not displayed. Just resting. Like the room was its den. Like the laundry room was not beneath it. But for it. The maid's mind struggled to process the contradiction. Power did not sleep in servant spaces. Monsters did not rest among folded cloth. But this one did. And that made it worse than anything she had imagined. Because violence could be understood. But calm could not. The beast shifted slightly. Not waking. Just adjusting. A slow breath expanded its chest. The sound echoed softly in the room like distant thunder trapped inside fabric. The maid instinctively stepped back. Her heel pressed against the edge of a folded stack. Nothing collapsed. Nothing reacted. The room seemed to tolerate her presence. As if evaluating whether she was temporary or permanent. Her eyes darted toward the exit. It was still open. Still there. Still possible. But something inside her hesitated. Because the beast had not reacted. Not once. It was aware. That much was clear. But it did not see her as threat. Or prey. It saw her as irrelevant. And that was almost more disturbing. She took another step back. Slow. Careful. Trying not to disturb the symmetry of the room. Then. A sound. Not from the beast. Deeper inside the stacks. A faint movement. Like fabric folding itself without hands. The maid froze again. Her eyes narrowed. The sound repeated. Deliberate. Rhythmic. Human. Impossible. Something was moving inside the laundry itself. And in that moment, the room stopped feeling like a place. It started feeling like a system. Something designed. Something maintained. Something alive in a way that had nothing to do with breath. The maid's pulse quickened. Her instinct screamed at her to leave. But her curiosity had already crossed the threshold. And behind her, the door slowly began to feel heavier. Not closing. Just waiting. As if deciding whether escape was still part of the rules. The maid stood between two unknowns. One sleeping. One hidden. And neither of them felt like accidents. They felt like purpose. And for the first time in her life inside the Alpha King's palace, She understood something terrifying. She had not entered a room. She had entered something that had been waiting for her to do exactly that. The moment the maid stepped fully inside the laundry room, the world behind her stopped feeling like an exit. It felt like a memory instead. Distant. Uncertain. Already deciding to fade. The door remained open, but its presence no longer carried meaning. It no longer represented escape. It simply marked where she had been allowed to enter. The air inside the room was different. Not colder. Not warmer. But heavier. As if the space itself had increased in density the moment she crossed the threshold. Every breath felt like it had to pass through layers of invisible fabric before reaching her lungs. The maid stood still for a moment, trying to regain control over her thoughts. Her instincts were screaming at her to leave. But her body did not move. Because her attention was no longer hers alone. It had been captured. Pulled forward. Drawn toward the center of the room where something impossible rested. The Alpha King's beast. Now that she was inside, it did not feel like legend anymore. It felt real. Too real. The creature lay curled between perfectly folded stacks of linen, as if the fabric had been arranged around it instead of the other way around. Its presence did not disrupt the order of the room. It defined it. The maid's eyes traced its shape slowly. Massive. Heavy. But not chaotic. Every line of its body suggested control. Even in sleep, it felt intentional. As if rest itself was a decision it had made rather than a state it had fallen into. The room did not tremble under its weight. Instead, it seemed to support it. Like the space had been built with this exact presence in mind. The maid swallowed. Her fingers tightened slightly. She tried to convince herself this was a mistake. A misunderstanding. A hallucination born from exhaustion. But then the beast exhaled. Slow. Deep. And the sound rolled through the fabric stacks like distant thunder trapped inside walls. The maid flinched. Not because it was loud. But because it was alive. And it acknowledged her presence without waking. That was the worst part. It knew she was there. But it did not care enough to react. Her mind began to fracture between fear and confusion. Beasts like this were not supposed to exist in servant spaces. They belonged in battlefields. In cages. In myths that ended in blood. Not in laundry rooms filled with folded cloth. Her gaze shifted carefully toward the exit again. Still open. Still visible. Still technically possible. But something had changed in the way she perceived it. The distance felt slightly longer. Not physically. But conceptually. Like the room was already beginning to decide how far she was allowed to move. She took a cautious step backward. Her heel brushed against a folded stack of fabric. It did not fall. It did not shift. It simply absorbed the contact, as if the material was designed to resist disturbance. Her breath slowed again. The silence around her deepened. Then, a sound. Soft. Subtle. Coming from deeper within the stacks. The maid froze instantly. It was not the beast. The beast remained still. Sleeping. Breathing. Uninterested. The sound came from somewhere else. Like fabric being folded. But not by hand she could see. Her eyes slowly turned toward the source. Between two towering stacks of linen, something moved. Not violently. Not suddenly. But deliberately. Like someone repeating a task they had done too many times to remember why. The maid's throat tightened. She stepped forward without realizing it. Just enough to see more clearly. And that was when she saw it. A shape. Human. Partially hidden behind layers of folded cloth. At first, it looked like a servant. But the longer she stared, the less human it became. The movements were too slow. Too structured. Too disconnected from awareness. It was folding cloth. Continuously. Endlessly. But the cloth it touched seemed to resist recognition. As if it was being reshaped at the same time it was being handled. The maid's stomach twisted. She took a half step forward. Hello. The word did not leave her mouth fully. It dissolved into the silence. The figure did not respond. It continued folding. But now she noticed something worse. The cloth it was folding was not changing position. It was repeating itself. Like the same fold was happening over and over again in slightly different forms. Time inside that motion did not behave correctly. The maid's breathing became shallow. This was not normal labor. This was something else entirely. Behind her, the beast shifted slightly. Not waking, just adjusting its position. And yet the movement changed the atmosphere instantly. The room reacted to it. The stacks of fabric felt closer. The air felt narrower. As if the space itself adjusted to its guardian's awareness. The maid turned her head slowly. The beast's eyes were still closed. But its presence had shifted. It was no longer passive. It was attentive. Not to her directly, but to the fact that something else inside the room had been noticed. The maid felt it then. A pressure. Not physical. Structural. Like the room itself was aware of her awareness. Like noticing too much was a violation of an unseen rule. Her feet instinctively moved backward. One step. Then another. But as she moved, something strange happened. The exit no longer felt aligned. It was still there. Still visible. But the angle felt wrong. As if the corridor outside had shifted slightly without moving at all. The maid's heart began to race. "No," she whispered under her breath. The word disappeared into the fabric-heavy silence. The room was changing how she perceived it. Not physically, but mentally. Like her sense of direction was being rewritten in real time. The figure among the laundry continued folding. Unbothered. Unaware. Or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge her existence. The beast remained still. But now its breathing felt slower. Heavier. More deliberate. As if it was monitoring not her actions, but her understanding. The maid forced herself to look away from the exit and focus on the impossible figure again. That was when she noticed the pattern. Every piece of fabric the figure touched carried something faint within its folds. Not texture. Not stain. But structure. Like information embedded into material. And suddenly, her mind made a connection it should not have been able to form. These weren't just clothes. They were organized. Categorized. Assigned. Her thoughts spiraled. The palace did not lose servants. It removed them. But removal was not destruction. It was transformation. The maid took a slow step forward again, drawn against her will. The figure's head tilted slightly. For the first time. Acknowledging something. Not her. Not fully. But her presence inside the system. The maid froze. Her breath caught. The figure's hands paused mid-fold. Then resumed. But slower now. As if the task had gained weight. Behind her, the beast shifted again. This time more noticeably. A single paw moved. Not aggressively. But strategically. Placing itself between her and the exit without blocking it completely. Like a boundary being drawn without force. The maid's mind screamed at her to leave. But something deeper had already begun to form. Understanding. Unwanted. Incomplete. But growing. This room was not a storage space. It was not a workplace. It was not even a prison in the traditional sense. It was a system of containment disguised as routine. And she was standing inside its living mechanism. The maid's eyes flicked between the figure, the beast, and the endless stacks of folded fabric. And for the first time since entering, she understood the second presence in the room was not the beast. It was the system itself. And it had already noticed her. The maid no longer felt like she was standing inside a room. That feeling had already been replaced. Now she felt like she was standing inside something that was aware of itself. Something that did not simply exist, but observed its own existence through her presence. The air had changed again. Not in temperature. Not in smell. But in weight. Every breath felt slower now, as if the room was deciding how much oxygen she was allowed to understand at a time. Her mind kept trying to return to normal explanations. Laundry room. Servants. Storage. Routine work. But every explanation collapsed the moment she looked around. Nothing here behaved like normal space. Nothing here obeyed the logic she had known her entire life. The beast still rested among the folded stacks. The servant-like figure still moved within the fabric. And yet neither felt separate from the room anymore. They felt like components. Like parts of something larger. Something structured. Something intentional. The maid slowly took a step backward without turning her back completely. Her eyes kept shifting between the exit and the impossible activity inside. But the exit was no longer comforting. It was just a direction. A suggestion of escape that felt less real the longer she looked at it. She swallowed hard. Her throat felt dry, as if the room itself was absorbing moisture from her fear. The servant figure continued its motion. Fold. Unfold. Refold. But now the maid noticed something new. The movements were not random repetition. They followed order. Invisible order. Like a sequence only the room understood. The fabric stacks around it were not just piles. They were arranged in layers. Some higher. Some lower. Some arranged in curves that made no architectural sense. And yet, everything fit. As if the room was building a pattern that only became visible when seen as a whole. The maid's fingers trembled slightly. She had seen many storage rooms in the palace before. But this was different. Those rooms were chaotic. Neglected. Forgotten. This room was the opposite. It was maintained with precision. Like a ritual. Like a system that refused decay. A sudden realization crawled into her mind. This was not a place where things were stored. This was a place where things were processed. Her eyes drifted again toward the servant figure. And for the first time, she noticed its face properly. Or what remained of it. It was not empty. It was incomplete. Like memory had been removed in layers instead of all at once. The expression did not show confusion. It showed absence. As if awareness itself had been stretched thin and then pressed flat. The maid stepped back again. This time faster. Her heel hit something soft. She looked down. Fabric. But not just fabric. It felt heavier than normal cloth should feel. Like it contained something inside it that resisted being ignored. She quickly lifted her foot away. Her breathing quickened. Behind her, the beast shifted again. A deeper exhale. Slower than before. This time, the sound did not feel passive. It felt alert. The maid turned her head slightly. The beast's eyes were still closed. But its presence had changed again. The room reacted instantly. The stacks of fabric seemed to align more tightly. The air became more structured. Even silence felt organized. The maid realized something unsettling. The beast was not just in the room. It was maintaining it. Like a guardian that didn't protect space from intruders, but protected the system from disruption. A cold thought entered her mind. What if she was the disruption? The servant figure suddenly paused. Completely. For the first time since she entered. No folding. No motion. Just stillness. The maid froze instantly. The silence that followed was heavier than anything before it. Even the beast did not move. Everything waited. Then, the figure slowly turned its head. Not fully. Not sharply. Just enough. Enough to acknowledge her completely. The maid's heart tightened painfully in her chest. Their eyes met. And in that moment, something passed between them that had no language. Not words. Not emotion. But recognition. The maid stepped back instinctively. But the figure did not follow. Instead, it resumed folding. Slower now. More deliberate. As if its awareness had shifted from task to observation. As if she had become part of the pattern now. The maid's breathing grew uneven. No, she whispered under her breath. The word vanished into the thick silence. The room did not react to her voice. It reacted to her understanding. And that was worse. Because now she could feel it. The structure beneath everything. The invisible order. The system. It was not just around her. It was through her. Every stack of fabric felt connected. Every fold felt like a record. Every motion felt like classification. Her mind tried to resist the conclusion forming inside it. But the conclusion was already forming without permission. People in the palace did not simply disappear. They were reassigned. Rewritten. Reformatted into something that served a purpose beyond recognition. The maid's stomach twisted. She looked again at the servant figure. And for the first time, she noticed something embedded in the folds it handled. Not stains. Not markings. But something closer to structure. Like identity compressed into material form. Her breath stopped. These were not clothes. They were fragments. Fragments of existence. The beast shifted again behind her. This time closer. Not aggressive. Not threatening. But deliberately repositioning. The maid turned slowly. And realized something horrifying. The beast was not blocking her exit. It was aligning her position. Like she was being placed somewhere within an unseen layout. Her feet moved backward automatically. But the space behind her felt different now. Not physically blocked. But defined. Like she had stepped into a coordinate that could no longer be changed freely. The maid's mind began to fracture under pressure. She was no longer sure what was room and what was system. No longer sure what was real and what was maintained. The servant figure resumed its folding motion. But now the rhythm had changed again. Faster. Smoother. Like the system had registered something new. The maid. Behind her, the beast exhaled slowly. And the entire room responded. The fabric stacks subtly shifted alignment. Not moving. Not collapsing. But reorganizing. The maid felt it then. A realization so sharp it almost made her stumble. The room was not reacting to her fear. It was reacting to her attention. The more she understood, the more the system adjusted. Like awareness itself triggered restructuring. She took a slow step back. The exit was still visible. Still present. But now it felt like a concept rather than a path. And then she saw it. Between two stacks of fabric, something she had missed before. A thin seam. Not a crack. Not a gap. A division. Like the room had layers. And she was standing in only one of them. Her breath shook. The servant figure paused again. And this time, it did not move at all. The beast opened one eye slightly. Just a slit. Not fully awake. But fully aware. And in that instant, the maid understood the most terrifying truth yet. She had not been brought into a room. She had been brought into a layer of something much larger. And that layer had just finished registering her existence. The moment the maid crossed the threshold of understanding, the room changed how it looked at her. Not visually. Not physically. But fundamentally. It was as if something inside the laundry room had quietly updated a record. A silent confirmation that she was no longer an outsider observing the system. But something the system was now observing back. The air grew denser again. Not heavier in weight alone, but in meaning. Every breath she took felt like it passed through invisible layers of classification before reaching her lungs. The maid stood frozen. Her mind was no longer racing forward. It was collapsing inward. Everything she thought she understood about the palace, the hierarchy, the servants, the disappearances, was breaking apart into fragments that refused to fit together anymore. The beast still rested behind her. The servant figure still moved among the folded stacks. But both now felt secondary. Like they were no longer the mystery. They were part of the explanation. And the explanation was worse than anything she had imagined. Slowly, unwillingly, her gaze drifted toward the fabric stacks again. But this time, she was no longer looking at them as objects. She was looking at them as records. Each fold felt deliberate. Each stack felt assigned. Each layer of cloth felt like it had meaning beyond texture or purpose. Her throat tightened. Something about the structure of the room had shifted. It was no longer random symmetry. It was organized memory. And then she saw it. Not with her eyes first. But with recognition that arrived too late. The laundry room was not storing clothes. It was storing identity. The realization did not come like a thought. It came like a collapse. As if her mind had reached a limit and folded inward under the weight of understanding. Her legs nearly gave out. She grabbed the edge of a nearby stack instinctively. The fabric felt soft. Too soft. Like it had been worn too many times by something that no longer existed in a stable form. She pulled her hand back immediately. Her fingers were shaking. "No," she whispered again, but this time the word had no resistance in it. Only disbelief trying to survive. Behind her, the beast shifted slightly. Not waking. Not reacting. But adjusting. As if it had registered her realization. As if understanding was the true trigger it monitored. The maid slowly turned her head toward the servant figure. It had stopped folding entirely now. Completely still. Waiting. Not for instruction. But for acknowledgement. And in that stillness, the truth finally surfaced fully. The maid saw it clearly now. The figure was not a servant in any normal sense. It was a remnant. A compressed existence. A life that had been stripped of continuity and reduced into function. Not erased. Not killed. But rewritten into repetitive structure. Her stomach twisted violently. The palace did not eliminate disobedience. It reformatted it. And the laundry room was the interface of that process. A place where identity was folded until it stopped being recognizable. Her eyes drifted back to the fabric stacks. Now she saw patterns she had missed before. Not decorative. Not accidental. But layered. Some stacks felt heavier. Some lighter. Some arranged in shapes that resembled organization charts she did not consciously recognize. Her mind tried to reject the thought. But it came anyway. These were not clothes. They were people. Or what remained of them after the system processed them. The maid staggered backward slightly. Her heel hit something soft again. This time she did not look down immediately. She was afraid of what she might understand. But when she forced herself to look, she saw it. A piece of fabric that looked ordinary at first glance. But as she focused, it felt wrong. Because it did not feel like fabric that had been made. It felt like fabric that had been become. Her breathing became uneven. The realization expanded. The palace did not lose servants. It did not exile them. It did not kill them. It converted them. Into structure. Into function. Into silence that could still be organized. Her eyes snapped shut for a moment. But the image did not disappear. It only intensified behind her eyelids. The servant figure shifted slightly again. And this time, its motion was slower. Almost aware. Not fully conscious. But no longer entirely absent either. The beast behind her exhaled. A deeper sound than before. And the room responded instantly. The fabric stacks tightened alignment. The air compressed slightly. The maid felt it immediately. The system was reacting not to movement, but to realization. Her understanding itself was being measured. Her knowledge itself was being recorded. She slowly opened her eyes again. And for the first time, she understood something that made her vision blur. The Alpha King was not simply ruling a kingdom. He was maintaining a structure. A containment system disguised as a palace. And the beast? The beast was not a weapon. It was a guardian function. A living mechanism designed to preserve stability. To ensure nothing inside this system escaped its intended structure. Her mind shook violently at the implications. If the beast was a guardian, then what was being guarded? She turned her head slowly toward the center of the room. The servant figure was now watching her. Not aggressively. Not emotionally. But with absolute recognition. And within that gaze, she felt something shift inside her perception again. Not externally. Internally. As if the room had begun to map her presence into its structure. Her identity felt less solid. Like it was being lightly pulled into categorization. She stumbled back. No, no, no. Her voice was barely audible. But the room still reacted. The fabric stacks subtly adjusted again. Not toward her. Around her. As if she was already being accounted for within the system's layout. The beast moved for the first time in a more noticeable way. It lifted its head slightly. Still not fully awake. But now undeniably aware. And in that moment, the maid saw it clearly. There was intelligence in its stillness. Not wild instinct. Not animal behavior. But controlled awareness. Purposeful restraint. It was not guarding the room. It was guarding the boundary between understanding and collapse. The maid felt her knees weaken. Because now she understood what that meant. The system did not just contain people. It contained knowledge of what had been done to them. The room was not a prison. It was a storage of erased continuity. A place where identity did not end. It was restructured into something that could no longer resist. Her breathing became shallow. The servant figure tilted its head slightly again. And this time, it felt like acknowledgement. Not of her presence, but of her transition. As if she had crossed from ignorance into classification. The beast shifted again. This time stepping slightly to the side. Not blocking her anymore. But not freeing her either. Creating space. A controlled allowance. A permission that felt more like observation than mercy. The maid's mind was breaking into fragments. She realized she was no longer being treated as a visitor. She was being processed. Slowly. Carefully. Not immediately transformed. But registered. The room had begun to include her in its structure of awareness. And that was the most terrifying part. Because nothing here reacted emotionally. Everything reacted structurally. The maid backed away slowly. Her body moving before her thoughts could catch up. The exit was still there. Still visible. Still open. But now it no longer felt like escape. It felt like a temporary interruption in processing. The servant figure resumed a small motion. One fold. Then another. Slower now. As if acknowledging that something new had been added to the system. The beast lowered its head again. And the room settled. Not into peace. But into confirmation. The maid was still alive. Still herself. But no longer entirely outside. She stood in silence. And for the first time, she understood the truth beneath everything. The laundry room was not a place where things were kept. It was a place where things were redefined. And she had just been seen by the system that decides what everything becomes. The silence after understanding was different. It was no longer empty. It was final. The maid stood in the center of the laundry room, but her body no longer felt like it belonged entirely to her. Something had changed. Not visibly. Not violently. But in the quiet way a decision becomes irreversible even before it is made. The air around her felt stable now, almost calm. And that calmness was the most frightening part of all. Because nothing in this place ever calmed without purpose. The beast remained where it had positioned itself earlier. Still. Watching. Not as a predator. Not as a protector in the human sense. But as something closer to a boundary made alive. The servant figure continued its slow folding motions among the stacks of fabric. But now those motions felt different. Less mechanical. More. Concluding. Like a process reaching its final stage. The maid's breathing was shallow. Her mind kept trying to return to who she was before she entered. A simple servant. A quiet worker. Someone invisible enough to survive. But that version of her felt distant now. Like it belonged to a life that had already been archived somewhere else. She looked toward the exit. It was still there. Still open. Still leading back into the corridor she had entered from. But something about it no longer felt like a doorway. It felt like a decision point. The room was no longer blocking her physically. It was waiting for her psychologically. Waiting to see what she would do with what she now knew. The Alpha King's beast shifted slightly. Not moving toward her. Not away from her. Just adjusting its position as if recalibrating the structure of the space itself. The maid swallowed. Her throat felt dry. Every instinct she had screamed the same thing. Leave. Forget. Survive. But now survival had a different shape. Because she understood something she could not understand. And that understanding was not neutral. It carried weight. It changed her. She took one slow step toward the exit. Nothing stopped her. No force. No sound. No resistance. But the moment her foot crossed into that direction, she felt it. A subtle shift in perception. As if the room had recorded the choice. The maid hesitated. Her body froze mid-motion. Because she realized something horrifying. The room was not preventing escape. It was allowing observation of escape. Like it wanted to see what she would become after leaving. The servant figure paused its folding again. The beast lifted its head slightly. Not fully awake. But fully attentive. And in that attention, the maid felt something worse than fear. She felt classification. like she was being sorted internally by something that did not need her permission. Her fingers trembled. She forced herself to keep moving. One step. Then another. The exit grew closer. But the closer she got, the more distant it felt in meaning. It was still physically real, but emotionally unstable. Like it belonged to a version of herself that no longer existed. Behind her, the laundry room remained unchanged. But she knew better now. Nothing here stayed unchanged. It only waited for revision. As she reached the threshold of the doorway, she stopped. Not because something blocked her, but because something inside her did. A realization rising slowly through her thoughts. If she left now, she would carry it. Not just memory, but structure. The system did not require physical containment. It required awareness. And she now had awareness. She turned her head slightly back toward the room. The beast was watching her. The servant figure had resumed folding. But slower. More final. Like a task nearing completion. The maid's heart pounded. She whispered, barely audible. "What are you?" The words did not echo. They dissolved. But the room responded anyway. Not loudly. Not visibly. But structurally. The fabric stacks subtly realigned. The beast exhaled. And for the first time, something like acknowledgement passed through the space. Not spoken. Not translated. But understood. The maid stepped fully into the corridor. And the moment she did, the temperature changed. The palace air felt familiar again. Too familiar. As if nothing had happened. As if she had simply completed a task. She stood still for a moment outside the laundry room door. It remained open behind her. Quiet. Ordinary. Almost boring. That was the lie. Because she knew what was inside it now. And knowing was irreversible. She took a step away. Then another. Each step should have felt like relief. But instead it felt like displacement. Like something inside her had not followed her completely. She stopped walking. Her hand slowly rose to her chest. Her heartbeat was steady. But it felt layered. As if there were more than one rhythm inside her now. She closed her eyes for a moment. And for a brief instant. She saw it again. Not the room. But the structure beneath it. Stacks. Layers. Folds. Not fabric. Not objects. But records. Compressed existence arranged in silence. Her eyes snapped open. She inhaled sharply. No. The word was softer now. Not denial. Recognition. She continued walking down the corridor. But something had changed in how the palace responded to her. The air felt slightly more attentive. The silence slightly more structured. Like the building itself had registered her differently now. Not as servant. Not as intruder. But as something newly categorized. She passed other doors. Other corridors. Other silent spaces that had once felt neutral. But now everything felt subtly aware. As if the palace had always been watching. And now she was part of what it was watching through. Her pace slowed. Her thoughts spiraled. The laundry room was still behind her. Still active in some sense she could not explain. But it no longer felt separate. It felt integrated. Like a layer beneath reality that remained attached even when not visible. She reached the lower corridor intersection and stopped again. Her reflection faintly appeared in a polished stone surface. She looked at herself. For a long moment. Nothing seemed different. But she did not trust that. Because she now understood that change here did not always appear externally. Sometimes it happened in what could no longer be separated from perception. Her reflection blinked. She did not remember blinking. She stepped back slightly. The reflection matched her movement. But something about the timing felt off. A fraction delayed. Like synchronization was no longer perfect. Her breath caught. She looked away quickly. And kept walking. But now every step felt monitored. Not by eyes. By structure. By something that did not need to see her to know she existed. The maid reached her quarters much later than expected. The world outside the laundry wing had continued normally. Servants moved. Doors opened. Orders were given. No one reacted to her differently. No one spoke to her. Everything appeared unchanged. But she knew better now. Change did not announce itself in the palace. It integrated quietly. That night, she sat alone in her small quarters. The walls felt closer than before. Or perhaps she was simply more aware of them. Her hands rested on her lap. Still trembling slightly, she tried to think of anything unrelated. But the laundry room refused to leave her thoughts. Not as memory, but as presence. Like something had followed her back without moving. Hours passed. The palace outside remained silent. But inside her mind, silence no longer meant peace. It meant structure continuing without interruption. She closed her eyes again. And once more, she saw it. The stacks. The folds. The beast. Not as individual images, but as a system. And within that system, a place where she now existed. Not fully. Not completely. But enough. Her eyes opened abruptly. Her breath quickened. She whispered into the dark. I left. But the silence did not answer. Because silence here was no longer empty. It was shared. And far below the palace, beyond what she could see or understand, something in the structure of the laundry room shifted slightly. As if acknowledging that one of its entries had temporarily stepped outside. But had not been fully released. Only paused. Waiting. And somewhere within that unseen system, the idea of return had already begun to form. The palace did not change overnight. It never did. It changed in the way memory changes when it is no longer trusted. Slowly. Quietly. Without permission. The maid sat in her quarters long after the night had ended, but she could not tell where night ended anymore. Time inside the palace still followed its usual rhythm. Guards changing shifts, lanterns dimming and brightening in controlled cycles, distant doors opening and closing with disciplined silence. But inside her perception, something had shifted permanently. The world no longer felt singular. It felt layered. Like there was always something happening beneath what she could see. Something folded underneath reality itself. She pressed her fingers against her chest again. Her heartbeat was steady. Too steady. Almost. Regulated. As if even her body had begun to adopt patterns it did not choose. She closed her eyes. And immediately, it returned. Not as a vision. Not as imagination. But as structure. The laundry room. The stacks. The beast. The servant figure. And beneath all of it, the system. It was no longer something she remembered. It was something she carried. Her breath tightened. She opened her eyes sharply. No. But the word no longer held denial. Only recognition. Days passed. Or perhaps hours. The palace never confirmed either. She continued her duties. Walking corridors. Folding garments. Lowering her head when nobles passed. Responding when spoken to. Everything appeared normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. Because now she could see what she had not seen before. Patterns. Not obvious. Not loud. But subtle alignments in the palace structure. Certain doors always remaining slightly warmer. Certain corridors always carrying faint fabric-like echoes. Certain servants moving with unnatural repetition in their tasks. She stopped noticing people as individuals. And started noticing them as placements. Positions in something larger. One afternoon, she passed a storage wing and froze without meaning to. The air felt familiar. Too familiar. Her hand tightened instinctively. Her feet stopped moving. No one else reacted. No alarms. No signals. But something inside her already knew. She was close again. Too close. She turned her head slowly toward the far corridor. The one leading down. To the lower restricted maintenance areas. Where servants were not assigned without reason. Where silence felt heavier than elsewhere. Her chest tightened. Her body resisted the direction. But not out of fear alone. Out of recognition. Because something inside her was responding before she consciously chose anything. As if the system beneath everything had already begun aligning her again. She took one step back. Then stopped. Her breath became uneven. And then, she heard it. Not with her ears first. but with understanding. A faint sound. Fabric shifting. Slow. Rhythmic. Like folding. Her stomach dropped. No, she whispered again. But this time it was weaker. Because she already knew what it meant. The laundry room was not a place that stayed behind. It was a place that remained connected. Always. She turned away quickly and walked back toward the upper corridors. But every step felt slightly misaligned. Like her direction was being observed from somewhere she could not see. That night, sleep did not come. Not because she was afraid. But because sleep felt unnecessary. Like something inside her was already continuing activity beneath rest. Her thoughts drifted. Not randomly. But in structured loops. Returning again and again to the same realization. The system had not released her. It had only paused interaction. And pauses could end. Always. She sat up suddenly in bed. Her heart was calm. Too calm. She placed her hand on her chest again. And for the first time, she noticed something new. A faint sensation. Not physical pain. Not emotion. But awareness. Like something inside her was aware of being inside her. Her breathing became shallow. No, she whispered. But the word no longer had direction. Because she could feel it now. Not outside. Not around. But beneath perception. The structure. Waiting. Days blurred again. The maid continued her duties, but her presence in the palace began to shift in subtle ways. Other servants hesitated slightly before speaking to her. Not out of fear. But confusion. As if something about her presence no longer aligned perfectly with normal expectation. She began noticing it too. Small inconsistencies in how others reacted. A pause too long. A glance that lingered slightly longer than necessary. Not recognition. But misalignment detection. The palace was noticing her differently. Not as an individual. But as a deviation. One afternoon, she found herself standing again near the lower corridor. She did not remember walking there. But she was there. That was becoming more common. Her feet felt guided. Not controlled. But influenced. As if direction was no longer purely hers. She stood still. The corridor ahead felt familiar in a way that made her stomach tighten. The same warmth. The same silence. The same structure beneath silence. Her breath slowed. She tried to turn back. But her body hesitated. Not refusing. Just delaying. Like decision itself had been distributed between her and something else. Then. A sound. Soft. Clear. Fabric folding. The maid closed her eyes instantly. It was not imagination. It was confirmation. Her hands trembled. Her entire body felt suddenly aware of something she had been trying not to acknowledge for days. The connection was still active. The system was still aware of her. Not as memory. But as presence. Her eyes opened slowly. And she turned toward the corridor again. Her feet moved without full consent. Step by step. Closer. Not forced. Not pulled. But aligned. The deeper she went, the more familiar everything became. Not in memory. But in structure. As if she had walked this path before in another state of understanding. The air thickened slightly. The warmth returned. The silence deepened. And then. The door appeared. The laundry room. Still slightly open. Still waiting. Exactly as it had been. As if no time had passed at all. Her breath caught. She stopped moving. Her entire body resisted forward motion. Not out of fear anymore. But out of awareness. Because now she understood something she had not understood before. The room was not calling her. It was completing a cycle. The beast would be there. The servant figure would still be folding. The structure would still exist. And she had never truly left it. Her fingers trembled at her sides. She whispered into the silence. I left. But the room did not respond. Because it did not need to. It already knew. She took one step forward. Then another. The door did not creak. It did not resist. It simply accepted. And the moment she stepped inside again, nothing felt like entry. It felt like continuation. The stacks were still there. The beasts still present. The servants still folding. But something subtle had changed. The alignment was different. More complete. More aware. As if the system had been waiting for this exact moment to resume processing. The beast opened its eyes slightly. Not fully. But enough. And this time, the maid did not feel fear. She felt recognition. Because now she understood what it was. Not guardian. Not monster. But boundary enforcement. The servant figure paused its folding. And turned slightly toward her. Not surprise. Not emotion. But acknowledgement of return. The maid stood still. Her breath calm now. Too calm. Because something inside her had already shifted into acceptance before she consciously decided anything. The system had not brought her back. It had simply allowed her to complete what was already initiated. And deep beneath the palace, the laundry room structure stabilized again. As if confirming the reintegration of a variable that had briefly stepped outside the pattern. The maid exhaled slowly. And for the first time, she did not ask what the room was anymore. Because now she understood the most terrifying truth of all. It was not a place she entered. It was a place that had already included her. And this time, it would not release her again. The moment the maid re-entered the laundry room, something subtle changed, not in what she saw, but in how the room treated her existence. It did not react like before. It did not evaluate her like before. This time, it recognized completion. As if her return was not an event, but a confirmation of a cycle already written long before she ever existed. The air inside the room was no longer heavy. It was balanced. Perfectly balanced. Too perfectly balanced. The maid stood still at the threshold, expecting fear to return, expecting confusion, expecting the crushing pressure of realization she had felt before. But none of it came. Instead, there was silence. Deep. Structured. Intentional. The kind of silence that does not hide something, but contains everything. The beast lay in its place among the folded stacks, but now its presence felt different. Not sleeping. Not watching. But settled. As if its purpose had entered a resting phase after completion. The servant figure inside the fabric stacks no longer moved. The folding had stopped entirely. For the first time since she discovered this place, there was no motion. No repetition. No task. Only structure. The maid's heartbeat slowed. Something was wrong. Not dangerous wrong. Not chaotic wrong. But final wrong. Like reaching the end of a sentence that was never meant to be spoken aloud. Her eyes moved slowly across the room. And now she saw something she had never been allowed to perceive before. Not with her eyes.